The first demand curve shifter we'll explore is a change in the number of consumers. Okay, now we have to remember that the demand curve that we are focusing on is a market demand curve. So assume you have a market for new cars, okay? Well, you have individual demand curves for every consumer or every person that desires a new car. Uh, for instance, let's think about something more practical. Let's say we're focusing on the demand for um, hamburgers, and you and your friends all eat hamburgers, and you go out a couple times a week and eat hamburgers. The question is, how many hamburgers do each of you eat? Okay, so assume it's you and two of your friends that you're analyzing, and this is the demand for friend number one. This is the demand for friend number two, and this is your demand, and we're just going to call it number three. Okay, and each of you have a demand for hamburgers that satisfies the law of demand. In other words, all of your demand curves are downward sloping. Okay, now let's assume that the price of a hamburger is $2.50. So assume that P prime equals $2.50. At $2.50, let's assume friend number one, okay, buys one hamburger at $2.50. So their demand curve looks something like that for hamburgers. Okay, now let's assume that your other friend, however, at $2.50 will purchase three hamburgers. Okay, so their quantity demanded at $2.50 is three hamburgers. Okay, and so their demand curve looks something like this, for instance. And that's their demand curve for hamburgers. Now let's assume that you, at $2.50, will purchase two hamburgers. Okay, so your quantity demanded at $2.50 will be two hamburgers. Okay, and so let's just say your demand curve for hamburgers looks something like this. Okay, now what does the market demand for hamburgers look like then? Well, it looks like this. We're just assuming there's only three of you in the market right now. Well, it looked like this. It would look like at $2.50. Okay, so at P prime equals 250. Okay, you would have 1 plus 3 plus 2 hamburgers. Okay, so at 250, the market demand for hamburgers, the market quantity demanded for hamburgers would be Q equals 6 hamburgers. So the market demand curve for hamburgers would look like this. Now, what happens when we add more consumers to this market? Well, when we add more consumers to this market, what we're doing is we're adding another demand curve. Okay, so assume a fourth consumer comes in, and at $2.50 per hamburger, they will consume one hamburger. Okay, their quantity demanded equals 1 at $2.50. Well, then at $2.50, what we would do is we would go over one more hamburger, and then that would be our new market demand for hamburgers. In other words, if we add consumers to the market for hamburgers, we would get an increase in the demand for hamburgers. Now let's assume that uh, we are back at this original demand curve, okay? So that this person never exists. That was just an experiment, and we'll just pretend that person never exists, and we're back at this demand curve again, the black demand curve. Now, let's assume that one of you goes on a diet and or becomes a vegetarian or something. And so let's assume consumer number one, let's assume this friend of yours here becomes a vegetarian and doesn't eat hamburgers anymore. Well, we would erase that person's demand from the market then, and what we would have left is at $2.50 there would be 5 hamburgers desired in the market. So we would come over here, 1 hamburger, and that would be our new market demand for hamburgers. In other words, if we subtract consumers from the market, the demand for the product will shift to the left. Demand will fall. Okay, so let me go over that again. We increase the number of consumers in a market, you increase demand. You shift it to the right. You decrease consumers in the market, you decrease demand. You shift it to the left.